Chapter 1. How the Black Sheep Came Forth from the Fold. The great bell of Beaulieu was ringing. Far away through the forest might be heard its musical clangor and swell. Peat cutters on Blackdown and fishers upon the Exe heard the distant throbbing rising and falling upon the sultry summer air. It was a common sound in those parts, as common as the chatter of the jays and the booming of the bittern. Yet the fishers and the peasants raised their heads and looked questions at each other, for the Angelus had already gone and Vespers was still far off. Why should the great bell of Beaulieu toll when the shadows were neither short nor long? All round the abbey the monks were trooping in. Under the long green paved avenues of gnarled oaks and of lichened beeches the white-robed brothers gathered to the sound. From the vineyard and the vine press, from the Bouverie or ox farm, from the marpits and sultans, even from the distant ironworks of Soulay and the outlying grange of St. Leonard's, they had all turned their steps homewards. It had been no sudden call. A swift messenger had the night before sped round to the outlying dependencies of the abbey, and had left the summons for every monk to be back in the cloisters by the 3rd hour after noontide. So urgent a message had not been issued within the memory of old lay brother Athanasius, who had cleaned the abbey knocker since the year after the Battle of Bannockburn. A stranger who knew nothing either of the abbey or of its immense resources might have gathered from the appearance of the brothers some conception of the varied duties which they were called upon to perform, and of the busy, widespread life which centered in the old monastery. As they swept gravely in by twos and by threes, with bended heads and muttering lips, there were few who did not bear upon them some signs of their daily toil. Here were two with wrists and sleeves all spotted with the ruddy grape juice. There again was a bearded brother with a broad-headed axe and a bundle of faggots upon his shoulders, while beside him walked another with the shears under his arm and the white wool still clinging to his whiter gown. A long, straggling troop bore spades and mattocks, while the two rearmost of all staggered along under a huge basket o' fresh-caught carp, for the morrow was Friday, and there were 50 platters to be filled and as many sturdy trenchermen behind them. Of all the throng there was scarce one who was not labour-stained and weary, for Abbot Berghurst was a hard man to himself and to others. Meanwhile, in the broad and lofty chamber set apart for occasions of import, the abbot himself was pacing impatiently backwards and forwards, with his long white nervous hands clasped in front of him. His thin, thought-worn features and sunken, haggard cheeks bespoke one who had indeed beaten down that inner foe whom every man must face, but had none the less suffered sorely in the contest. In crushing his passions he had well nigh crushed himself. Yet, frail as was his person, there gleamed out ever and anon from under his drooping brows a flash of fierce energy, which recalled to men's minds that he came of a fighting stock, and that even now his twin brother, Sir Bartholomew Berghurst, was one of the most famous of those stern warriors who had planted the cross of St. George before the gates of Paris. With lips compressed and clouded brow, he strode up and down the oaken floor, the very genius and impersonation of asceticism, while the great bell still thundered and clanged above his head. At last the uproar died away in 3 last, measured throbs, and ere their echo had ceased the abbot struck a small gong which summoned a lay brother to his presence. "Have the brethren come?" he asked, in the Anglo-French dialect used in religious houses. "They are here," the other answered, with his eyes cast down and his hands crossed upon his chest. "All?" 32 of the seniors and 15 of the novices, most holy father. Brother Mark of the Spicarium is sore smitten with a fever and could not come. He said that. It boots not what he said. Fever or no, he should have come at my call. His spirit must be chastened, as must that of many more in this abbey. You yourself, Brother Francis, have twice raised your voice, so it hath come to my ears, when the reader in the refectory hath been dealing with the lives of God's most blessed saints. What hast thou to say?" The lay brother stood meek and silent, with his arms still crossed in front of him. 1,000 Aves and as many credos, said standing with arms outstretched before the shrine of the Virgin, may help thee to remember that the Creator hath given us 2 ears and but 1 mouth, as a token that there is twice the work for the one as for the other. Where is the master of the novices? He is without, most holy Father. Send him hither. The sandaled feet clattered over the wooden floor, and the iron-bound door creaked upon its hinges. In a few moments it opened again to admit a short square monk with a heavy, composed face and an authoritative manner. "You have sent for me, Holy Father." "Yes, Brother Jerome, I wish that this matter be disposed of with as little scandal as may be, and yet it is needful that the example should be a public one." The abbot spoke in Latin now, as a language which was more fitted by its age and solemnity to convey the thoughts of two high dignitaries of the order. "It would, perchance, be best that the novices be not admitted," suggested the master. "This mention of a woman may turn their minds from their pious meditations to worldly and evil thoughts." "Woman! Woman!" groaned the abbot. "Well has the holy Chrysostom termed them radix malorum. From Eve downwards, what good hath come from any of them? Who brings the plaint?" "It is Brother Ambrose, a holy and devout young man, a light and a pattern to every novice." "Let the matter be brought to an issue then according to our old-time monastic habit. Bid the Chancellor and the Sub-Chancellor lead in the brothers according to age, together with Brother John, the accused, and Brother Ambrose, the accuser. And the novices? Let them bide in the north alley of the cloisters. Stay. Bid the Sub-Chancellor send out to them Thomas the Lector to read unto them from the Gesta Vitae Benedicti. It may save them from foolish and pernicious babbling." The abbot was left to himself once more, and bent his thin grey face over his illuminated breviary. So he remained while the senior monks filed slowly and sedately into the chamber, seating themselves upon the long oaken benches which lined the wall on either side. At the further end, in two high chairs as large as that of the abbot, though hardly as elaborately carved, sat the master of the novices and the chancellor, the latter a broad and portly priest, with dark mirthful eyes and a thick outgrowth of crisp black hair all round his tonsured head. Between them stood a lean, white-faced brother who appeared to be ill at ease, shifting his feet from side to side and tapping his chin nervously with the long parchment roll which he held in his hand. The abbot, from his point of vantage, looked down on the two long lines of faces, placid and sun-browned for the most part, with the large bovine eyes and unlined features which told of their easy, unchanging existence. Then he turned his eager fiery gaze upon the pale-faced monk who faced him. "This plaint is thine, as I learn, Brother Ambrose," said he. "May the Holy Benedict, patron of our house, be present this day and aid us in our findings. How many counts are there?" "3, Most Holy Father," the brother answered in a low and quavering voice. "Have you set them forth according to rule?" "They are here set down, Most Holy Father, upon a cantle of sheepskin." "Let the sheepskin be handed to the Chancellor. Bring in Brother John, and let him hear the plaints which have been urged against him." At this order a lay brother swung open the door, and two other lay brothers entered, leading between them a young novice of the order. He was a man of huge stature, dark-eyed and red-headed, with a peculiar half-humorous, half-defiant expression upon his bold, well-marked features. His cowl was thrown back upon his shoulders, and his gown, unfastened at the top, disclosed a round, sinewy neck, ruddy and corded like the bark of the fir. Thick, muscular arms, covered with a reddish down, protruded from the wide sleeves of his habit, while his white shirt, looped up upon one side, gave a glimpse of a huge knotty leg, scarred and torn with the scratches of brambles. With a bow to the abbot, which had in it perhaps more pleasantry than reverence, the novice strode across to the carved prie-dieu which had been set apart for him, and stood silent and erect with his hand upon the gold bell which was used in the private orisons of the abbot's own household. His dark eyes glanced rapidly over the assembly, and finally settled with a grim and menacing twinkle upon the face of his accuser. The Chancellor rose, and having slowly unrolled the parchment scroll, proceeded to read it out in a thick and pompous voice, while a subdued rustle and movement among the brothers bespoke the interest with which they followed the proceedings. Charges brought upon the second Thursday after the Feast of the Assumption, in the year of our Lord 1366, against Brother John, formerly known as Hordle John, or John of Hordle, but now a novice in the holy monastic order of the Cistercians. Read upon the same day at the abbey of Beaulieu in the presence of the most reverend Abbot Berghush and of the assembled order. The charges against the said brother John are the following, namely, to wit. First, that on the above-mentioned feast of the Assumption, small beer having been served to the novices in the proportion of 1 quart to each 4, the said brother John did drain the pot at 1 draught to the detriment of brother Paul, brother Porphyry and brother Ambrose, who could scarce eat their meat of salted stockfish on account of their exceeding dryness. At this solemn indictment the novice raised his hand and twitched his lip, while even the placid senior brothers glanced across at each other and coughed to cover their amusement. The abbot alone sat grey and immutable, with a drawn face and a brooding eye. Item, that having been told by the master of the novices that he should restrict his food for 2 days to a single 3-pound loaf of bran and beans, for the greater honouring and glorifying of Saint Monica, mother of the holy Augustine, he was heard by brother Ambrose and others to say that he wished 20,000 devils would fly away with the said Monica, mother of the holy Augustine, or any other saint who came between a man and his meat. Item, that upon brother Ambrose reproving him for this blasphemous wish, he did hold the said brother face downwards over the piscatorium or fish pond for a space during which the said brother was able to repeat a pater and 4 aves for the better fortifying of his soul against impending death. There was a buzz and murmur among the White Frock brethren at this grave charge, but the abbot held up his long quivering hand. "What then?" said he. Item, that between nones and vespers on the feast of James the Less the said brother John was observed upon the Brockenhurst road, near the spot which is known as Hatchet's Pond in converse with a person of the other sex, being a maiden of the name of Mary Sowley, the daughter of the king's verderer. Item, that after sundry japes and jokes the said brother John did lift up the said Mary Sowley and did take, carry, and convey her across a stream, to the infinite relish of the devil and the exceeding detriment of his own soul, which scandalous and wilful falling away was witnessed by 3 members of our order. A dead silence throughout the room, with a rolling of heads and upturning of eyes, bespoke the pious horror of the community. The abbot drew his grey brows low over his fiercely questioning eyes. "Who can vouch for this thing?" he asked. "That can I," answered the accuser. "So too can brother Porphyry, who was with me, and brother Mark of the Spicarium, who hath been so much stirred and inwardly troubled by the sight that he now lies in a fever through it." "And the woman?" asked the abbot. "Did she not break into lamentation and woe that a brother should so demean himself?" "Nay, she smiled sweetly upon him and thanked him. I can vouch it, and so can brother Porphyry." "Canst thou?" cried the abbot, in a high, tempestuous tone. "Canst thou so? Hast forgotten that the 35th rule of the order is that in the presence of a woman the face should be ever averted and the eyes cast down? Hast forgot it, I say? If your eyes were upon your sandals, how came ye to see this smile of which ye prate? A week in your cells, false brethren, a week of rye bread and lentils, with double lauds and double matins, may help ye to remembrance of the laws under which ye live." At this sudden outflame of wrath the 2 witnesses sank their faces onto their chests, and sat as men crushed. The abbot turned his angry eyes away from them and bent them upon the accused, who met his searching gaze with a firm and composed face. "What hast thou to say, brother John, upon these weighty things which are urged against you?" "Little enough, good father, little enough," said the novice, speaking English with a broad West Saxon drawl. The brothers, who were English to a man, pricked up their ears at the sound of the homely and yet unfamiliar speech, but the abbot flushed red with anger, and struck his hand upon the oaken arm of his chair. "What talk is this?" he cried. "Is this a tongue to be used within the walls of an old and well-famed monastery? But grace and learning have ever gone hand in hand, and when one is lost it is needless to look for the other." "I know not about that," said brother John. "I know only that the words come kindly to my mouth, for it was the speech of my fathers before me. Under your favour, I shall either use it now or hold my peace." The abbot patted his foot and nodded his head, as one who passes a point but does not forget it. "For the matter of the ale," continued brother John, I had come in hot from the fields and had scarce got the taste of the thing before mine eye lit upon the bottom of the pot. It may be, too, that I spoke somewhat shortly concerning the bran and the beans, the same being poor provender and unfitted for a man of my inches. It is true also that I did lay my hands upon this jackful of a brother Ambrose, though, as you can see, I did him little scathe. As regards the maid, too, it is true that I did heft her over the stream, she having on her hosen and shoon, whilst I had but my wooden sandals, which could take no hurt from the water. I should have thought shame upon my manhood, as well as my monkhood, if I had held back my hand from her. He glanced around as he spoke with the half-amused look which he had worn during the whole proceedings. "There is no need to go further," said the abbot. "He has confessed to all. It only remains for me to portion out the punishment which is due to his evil conduct." He rose, and the two long lines of brothers followed his example, looking sideways with scared faces at the angry prelate. "John of Hordle," he thundered, "you have shown yourself during the 2 months of your novitiate to be a recreant monk, and one who is unworthy to wear the white garb which is the outer symbol of the spotless spirit. That dress shall therefore be stripped from thee, and thou shalt be cast into the outer world without benefit of clerkship, and without lot or part in the graces and blessings of those who dwell under the care of the blessed Benedict. Thou shalt come back neither to Beaulieu nor to any of the granges of Beaulieu, and thy name shall be struck off the scrolls of the order." The sentence appeared a terrible one to the older monks, who had become so used to the safe and regular life of the abbey that they would have been as helpless as children in the outer world. From their pious oasis they looked dreamily out at the desert of life, a place full of stormings and strivings, comfortless, restless, and overshadowed by evil. The young novice, however, appeared to have other thoughts, for his eyes sparkled and his smile broadened. It needed but that to add fresh fuel to the fiery mood of the prelate. "So much for thy spiritual punishment," he cried. "But it is to thy grosser feelings that we must turn in such natures as thine, and as thou art no longer under the shield of Holy Church there is the less difficulty. Ho there! Lay brothers, Francis, Naomi, Joseph, seize him and bind his arms. Drag him forth, and let the foresters and the porters scourge him from the precincts." As these 3 brothers advanced towards him to carry out the abbot's direction, the smile faded from the novice's face, and he glanced right and left with his fierce brown eyes, like a bull at a baiting. Then, with a sudden deep-chested shout, he tore up the heavy oaken prie-dieu and poised it to strike, taking 2 steps backward the while, that none might take him at advantage. "By the black rood of Waltham," he roared, "if any knave among you lays a finger end upon the edge of my gown, I will crush his skull like a filbert." With his thick knotted arms, his thundering voice, and his bristle of red hair, there was something so repellent in the man that the 3 brothers flew back at the very glare of him, and the 2 rows of white monks strained away from him like poplars in a tempest. The abbot only sprang forward with shining eyes, but the chancellor and the master hung upon either arm and wrested him back out of danger's way. "He is possessed of a devil," they shouted. "Run, Brother Ambrose, Brother Joachim! Call Hugh of the Mill, and Woodman Watt, and Raoul with his arbalist and bolts. Tell them that we are in fear of our lives. Run, run! For the love of the Virgin!" But the novice was a strategist as well as a man of action. Springing forward, he hurled his unwieldy weapon at Brother Ambrose, and, as desk and monk clattered onto the floor together, he sprang through the open door and down the winding stair. Sleepy old Brother Athanasius, at the porter's cell, had a fleeting vision of twinkling feet and flying skirts, but before he had time to rub his eyes the recreant had passed the lodge, and was speeding as fast as his sandals could patter along the Lyndhurst road. Chapter 2. How Alleyne Edricson came out into the world. Never had the peaceful atmosphere of the old Cistercian house been so rudely ruffled. Never had there been insurrections so sudden, so short, and so successful. Yet the Abbot Berghurst was a man of too firm a grain to allow one bold outbreak to imperil the settled order of his great household. In a few hot and bitter words, he compared their false brother's exit to the expulsion of our first parents from the garden, and more than hinted that unless a reformation occurred, some others of the community might find themselves in the same evil and perilous case. Having thus pointed the moral and reduced his flock to a fitting state of docility, he dismissed them once more to their labors and withdrew himself to his own private chamber, there to seek spiritual aid in the discharge of the duties of his high office. The abbot was still on his knees, when a gentle tapping at the door of his cell broke in upon his orisons. Rising in no very good humor at the interruption, he gave the word to enter, but his look of impatience softened down into a pleasant and paternal smile as his eyes fell upon his visitor. He was a thin-faced, yellow-haired youth, rather above the middle size, comely and well-shopen, with straight, lithe figure and eager, boyish features. His clear, pensive grey eyes, and quick, delicate expression, spoke of a nature which had unfolded far from the boisterous joys and sorrows of the world. Yet there was a set of the mouth and a prominence of the chin which relieved him of any trace of effeminacy. Impulsive he might be, enthusiastic, sensitive, with something sympathetic and adaptive in his disposition, but an observer of nature's tokens would have confidently pledged himself that there was native firmness and strength underlying his gentle, monk-bred ways. The youth was not clad in monastic garb, but in lay attire, though his jerkin, cloak and hose were all of a sombre hue, as befitted one who dwelt in sacred precincts. A broad leather strap hanging from his shoulder supported a scrip or satchel such as travellers were wont to carry. In one hand he grasped a thick staff pointed and shod with metal, while in the other he held his coif or bonnet, which bore in its front a broad pewter medal stamped with the image of Our Lady of Rocamadour. "Art ready, then, fair son?" said the abbot. "This is indeed a day of comings and of goings. It is strange that in 12 hours the abbey should have cast off its foulest weed and should now lose what we are fain to look upon as our choicest blossom." "You speak too kindly, father," the youth answered. "If I had my will I should never go forth, but should end my days here in Beaulieu. It hath been my home as far back as my mind can carry me, and it is a sore thing for me to have to leave it." "Life brings many a cross," said the abbot gently. "Who is without them? Your going forth is a grief to us as well as to yourself. But there is no help. I had given my forward and sacred promise to your father, Edric the Franklin, that at the age of 20 you should be sent out into the world to see for yourself how you like the savour of it. Seat thee upon the settle, Alleyne, for you may need rest ere long." The youth sat down as directed, but reluctantly and with diffidence. The abbot stood by the narrow window, and his long black shadow fell slantwise across the rush-strewn floor. 20 years ago," he said, "your father, the Franklin of Minstead, died, leaving to the abbey 3 hides of rich land in the 100 of Melwood, and leaving to us also his infant son on condition that we should rear him until he came to man's estate. This he did partly because your mother was dead, and partly because your elder brother, now Sockman of Minstead, had already given sign of that fierce and rude nature which would make him no fit companion for you. It was his desire and request, however, that you should not remain in the cloisters, but should at a ripe age return into the world." "But, father," interrupted the young man, "it is surely true that I am already advanced several degrees in clerkship." "Yes, fair son, but not so far as to bar you from the garb you now wear or the life which you must now lead. You have been porter?" "Yes, father." "Exorcist?" "Yes, father." "Reader?" "Yes, father." "Acolyte?" "Yes, father." "But have sworn no vow of constancy or chastity?" "No, father." "Then you are free to follow a worldly life. But let me hear, ere you start, what gifts you take away with you from Beaulieu. Some I already know. There is the playing of the citoli and the rebec. Our choir will be dumb without you. You carve too." The youth's pale face flushed with the pride of the skilled workman. "Yes, Holy Father," he answered. "Thanks to good brother Bartholomew, I carve in wood and in ivory, and can do something also in silver and in bronze. From Brother Francis I have learned to paint on vellum, on glass, and on metal, with a knowledge of those pigments and essences which can preserve the colour against damp or a biting air. Brother Luke hath given me some skill in damask work, and in the enamelling of shrines, tabernacles, diptychs, and triptychs. For the rest, I know a little of the making of covers, the cutting of precious stones, and the fashioning of instruments. A goodly list, truly, cried the superior with a smile. What clerk of Cambridge or of Oxenford could say as much? But of thy reading hast not so much to show there, I fear? No, father, it hath been slight enough. Yet, thanks to our good Chancellor, I am not wholly unlettered. I have read Ockham, Bradwardine, and other of the schoolmen, together with the learned Duns Scotus and the Book of the Holy Aquinas. But of the things of this world, what have you gathered from your reading? From this high window you may catch a glimpse over the wooden point and the smoke of Buckleshard of the mouth of the Exe, and the shining sea. Now, I pray you, Alleyne, if a man were to take a ship and spread sail across yonder waters, where might he hope to arrive? The youth pondered, and drew a plan amongst the rushes with the point of his staff. Holy Father, said he would come upon those parts of France which are held by the King's Majesty. But if he trended to the south he might reach Spain and the Barbary states. To his north would be Flanders and the country of the Eastlanders and of the Muscovites. True. And how if, after reaching the king's possessions, he still journeyed on to the eastward? He would then come upon that part of France which is still in dispute, and he might hope to reach the famous city of Avignon, where dwells our blessed Father, the prop of Christendom. And then he would pass through the land of the Almains and the great Roman Empire, and so to the country of the Huns and of the Lithuanian pagans, beyond which lies the great city of Constantine and the kingdom of the unclean followers of Mahmud. And beyond that, fair son? Beyond that is Jerusalem and the Holy Land, and the great river which hath its source in the Garden of Eden. And then? Nay, good father, I cannot tell. Methinks the end of the world is not far from there. Then we can still find something to teach thee, Alleyne, said the abbot complacently. Know that many strange nations lie betwixt there and the end of the world. There is the country of the Amazons, and the country of the dwarfs, and the country of the fair but evil women who slay with beholding, like the basilisk. Beyond that again is the kingdom of Prester John and of the great Cham. These things I know for very sooth, for I had them from that pious Christian and valiant knight, Sir John de Mandeville, who stopped twice at Beaulieu on his way to and from Southampton, and discoursed to us concerning what he had seen from the reader's desk in the refectory, until there was many a good brother who got neither bit nor sup, so stricken were they by his strange tales. I would fain know, father, asked the young man, what there may be at the end of the world. There are some things, replied the abbot gravely, into which it was never intended that we should inquire. But you have a long road before you. Whither will you first turn? To my brother's at Minstead. If he be indeed an ungodly and violent man, there is the more need that I should seek him out and see whether I cannot turn him to better ways. The abbot shook his head. The Sockman of Minstead hath earned an evil name over the countryside, he said. If you must go to him, see at least that he doth not turn you from the narrow path upon which you have learned to tread. But you are in God's keeping, and God ward should you ever look in danger and in trouble. Above all, shun the snares of women, for they are ever set for the foolish feet of the young. Kneel down, my child, and take an old man's blessing. Alleyne Edricson bent his head while the abbot poured out his heartfelt supplication that heaven would watch over this young soul, now going forth into the darkness and danger of the world. It was no mere form for either of them. To them the outside life of mankind did indeed seem to be one of violence and of sin, beset with physical and still more with spiritual danger. Heaven, too, was very near to them in those days. God's direct agency was to be seen in the thunder and the rainbow, the whirlwind and the lightning. To the believer, clouds of angels and confessors, and martyrs, armies of the sainted and the saved, were ever stooping over their struggling brethren upon earth, raising, encouraging, and supporting them. It was then with a lighter heart and a stouter courage that the young man turned from the abbot's room, while the latter, following him to the stairhead, finally commended him to the protection of the holy Julian, patron of travellers. Underneath, in the porch of the abbey, the monks had gathered to give him a last Godspeed. Many had brought some parting token by which he should remember them. There was Brother Bartholomew with a crucifix of rare carved ivory, and Brother Luke with a white-backed psalter adorned with golden bees, and Brother Francis with the slaying of the innocents most daintily set forth upon vellum. All these were duly packed away deep in the traveller's scrip, and above them old pippin-faced Brother Athanasius had placed a parcel of simnel bread and ram-mel cheese, with a small flask of the famous blue-sealed abbey wine. So, amid handshakings and laughings and blessings, Alleyne Edricson turned his back upon Beaulieu. At the turn of the road he stopped and gazed back. There was the widespread building which he knew so well, the abbot's house, the long church, the cloisters with their line of arches, all bathed and mellowed in the evening sun. There too was the broad sweep of the river Exe, the old stone well, the canopied niche of the Virgin, and in the centre of all the cluster of white-robed figures who waved their hands to him. A sudden mist swam up before the young man's eyes, and he turned away upon his journey with a heavy heart and a choking throat. Chapter 3. How Hordle John cozened the fuller of Lymington. It is not, however, in the nature of things that a lad of 20, with young life glowing in his veins and all the wide world before him, should spend his first hours of freedom in mourning for what he had left. Long ere Alleyne was out of sound of the Beaulieu bells he was striding sturdily along, swinging his staff and whistling as merrily as the birds in the thicket. It was an evening to raise a man's heart. The sun shining slantwise through the trees threw delicate traceries across the road, with bars of golden light between. Away in the distance before and behind, the green boughs, now turning in places to a coppery redness, shot their broad arches across the track. The still summer air was heavy with the resinous smell of the great forest. Here and there a tawny brook prattled out from among the underwood and lost itself again in the ferns and brambles upon the further side. Save the dull piping of insects and the sough of the leaves, there was silence everywhere, the sweet restful silence of nature. And yet there was no want of life, the whole wide wood was full of it. Now it was a lithe, furtive stoat which shot across the path upon some fell errand of its own. Then it was a wild cat which squatted upon the outlying branch of an oak and peeped at the traveller with a yellow and dubious eye. Once it was a wild sow which scuttled out of the bracken, with 2 young sounders at her heels, and once a lordly red stag had walked daintily out from among the tree trunks, and looked around him with the fearless gaze of one who lived under the king's own high protection. Alleyne gave his staff a merry flourish, however, and the red deer bethought him that the king was far off, so streaked away from whence he came. The youth had now journeyed considerably beyond the furthest domains of the abbey. He was the more surprised therefore when, on coming round a turn in the path, he perceived a man clad in the familiar garb of the order, and seated in a clump of heather by the roadside. Alleyne had known every brother well, but this was a face which was new to him, a face which was very red and puffed, working this way and that, as though the man were sore perplexed in his mind. Once he shook both hands furiously in the air, and twice he sprang from his seat and hurried down the road. When he rose, however, Alleyne observed that his robe was much too long and loose for him in every direction, trailing upon the ground and bagging about his ankles, so that even with trussed-up skirts he could make little progress. He ran once, but the long gown clogged him so that he slowed down into a shambling walk, and finally plumped into the heather once more. "Young friend," said he, when Alleyne was abreast of him, "I fear from thy garb that thou canst know little of the Abbey of Beaulieu." "Then you are in error, friend," the clerk answered, "for I have spent all my days within its walls." "As't so indeed?" cried he. "Then perhaps canst tell me the name of a great loathly lump of a brother wi freckled face and a hand like a spade. His eyes were black and his hair was red and his voice like the parish bull. I trow that there cannot be 2 alike in the same cloisters." That surely can be no other than brother John, said Alleyne. I trust he has done you no wrong, that you should be so hot against him. Wrong, quotha, cried the other, jumping out of the heather. Wrong? Why, he hath stolen every plack of clothing off my back, if that be a wrong, and hath left me here in this sorry frock of white falding, so that I have shame to go back to my wife, lest she think that I have donned her old kirtle. Harrow and alas that ever I should have met him. But how came this? Asked the young clerk, who could scarce keep from laughter at the sight of the hot little man so swathed in the great white cloak. It came in this way, he said, sitting down once more. I was passing this way, hoping to reach Lymington ere nightfall, when I came on this red-headed knave seated even where we are sitting now. I uncovered and louted as I passed, thinking that he might be a holy man at his orisons, but he called to me and asked me if I had heard speak of the new indulgence in favour of the Cistercians. Not I answered. Then the worse for thy soul, said he, and with that he broke into a long tale how that on account of the virtues of the abbot Berghosh it had been decreed by the Pope that whoever should wear the habit of a monk of Beaulieu for as long as he might say the 7 Psalms of David should be assured of the kingdom of heaven. When I heard this I prayed him on my knees that he would give me the use of his gown, which after many contentions he at last agreed to do, on my paying him 3 marks towards the regilding of the image of Lawrence the Martyr. Having stripped his robe, I had no choice but to let him have the wearing of my good leathern jerkin and hose, for, as he said, it was chilling to the blood and unseemly to the eye to stand frockless whilst I made my orisons. He had scarce got them on, and it was a sore labour, seeing that my inches will scarce match my girth. He had scarce got them on, I say, and I not yet at the end of the 2nd Psalm, when he bade me do honour to my new dress, and with that set off down the road as fast as feet would carry him. For myself, I could no more run than if I had been sewn in a sack, so here I sit, and here I am like to sit, before I set eyes upon my clothes again. Nay, friend, take it not so sadly, said Alleyne, clapping the disconsolate one upon the shoulder. Canst change thy robe for a jerkin once more at the abbey, unless perchance you have a friend near at hand. That have I, he answered, and close, but I care not to go nigh him in this plight, for his wife hath a gibing tongue, and will spread the tale until I could not show my face in any market from Fordingbridge to Southampton. But if you, fair sir, out of your kind charity would be pleased to go a matter of 2 bow shots out of your way, you would do me such a service as I could scarce repay. With all my heart, said Alleyne readily. Then take this pathway on the left, I pray thee, and then the deer track which passes on the right. You will then see under a great beech tree the hut of a charcoal burner. Give him my name, good sir, the name of Peter the Fuller, of Lymington, and ask him for a change of raiment, that I may pursue my journey without delay. There are reasons why he would be loath to refuse me. Alleyne started off along the path indicated, and soon found the log hut where the burner dwelt. He was away faggot cutting in the forest, but his wife, a ruddy bustling dame, found the needful garments and tied them into a bundle. While she busied herself in finding and folding them, Alleyne Edricson stood by the open door looking in at her with much interest and some distrust, for he had never been so nigh to a woman before. She had round red arms, a dress of some sober woolen stuff, and a brass brooch the size of a cheesecake stuck in the front of it. Peter the Fuller, she kept repeating. Marry, come up. If I were Peter the Fuller's wife I would teach him better than to give his clothes to the first knave who asks for them. But he was always a poor, fond, silly creature, was Peter, though we are beholden to him for helping to bury our 2nd son Wat, who was apprenticed to him at Lymington in the year of the Black Death. But who are you, young sir? I am a clerk on my road from Beaulieu to Minstead. I, indeed. Hast been brought up at the abbey then? I could read it from thy reddened cheek and downcast eye. Hast learned from the monks, I trow, to fear a woman as thou wouldst a lazar house. Out upon them! That they should dishonour their own mothers by such teaching. A pretty world it would be with all the women out of it. Heaven forfend that such a thing should come to pass, said Alleyne. Amen and amen. But thou art a pretty lad, and the prettier for thy modest ways. It is easy to see from thy cheek that thou hast not spent thy days in the rain and the heat and the wind, as my poor Wat hath been forced to do. I have indeed seen little of life, good dame. Wilt find nothing in it to pay for the loss of thy own freshness. Here are the clothes, and Peter can leave them when next he comes this way. Holy Virgin! See the dust upon thy doublet. It were easy to see that there is no woman to tend to thee. So, that is better. Now buss me, boy. Alleyne stooped and kissed her, for the kiss was the common salutation of the age, and, as Erasmus long afterwards remarked, more used in England than in any other country. Yet it sent the blood to his temples again, and he wondered, as he turned away, what the Abbot Berghush would have answered to so frank an invitation. He was still tingling from this new experience when he came out upon the high road and saw a sight which drove all other thoughts from his mind. Some way down from where he had left him the unfortunate Peter was stamping and raving tenfold worse than before. Now, however, instead of the great white cloak, he had no clothes on at all, save a short woolen shirt and a pair of leather shoes. Far down the road a long-legged figure was running, with a bundle under one arm and the other hand to his side, like a man who laughs until he is sore. "See him," yelled Peter. "Look to him. You shall be my witness. He shall see Winchester jail for this. See where he goes with my cloak under his arm." "Who then?" cried Alleyne. "Who but that cursed brother John? He hath not left me clothes enough to make a gallybagger. The double thief hath cozened me out of my gown." "Stay though, my friend, it was his gown," objected Alleyne. "It boots not. He hath them all, gown, jerkin, hosen, and all. Gramercy to him that he left me the shirt and the shoon. I doubt not that he will be back for them anon." "But how came this?" asked Alleyne, open-eyed with astonishment. "Are those the clothes? For dear charity's sake give them to me. Not the Pope himself shall have these from me, though he sent the whole college of cardinals to ask it." "How came it?" "Why, you had scarce gone ere this loathly John came running back again, and, when I oped mouth to reproach him, he asked me whether it was indeed likely that a man of prayer would leave his own godly raiment in order to take a layman's jerkin. He had, he said, but gone for a while that I might be the freer for my devotions. On this I plucked off the gown, and he with much show of haste did begin to undo his points, but when I threw his frock down he clipped it up and ran off all untrussed, leaving me in this sorry plight. He laughed so the while, like a great croaking frog, that I might have caught him had my breath not been as short as his legs were long." The young man listened to this tale of wrong with all the seriousness that he could maintain, but at the sight of the pursy red-faced man and the dignity with which he bore him, the laughter came so thick upon him that he had to lean up against a tree trunk. The fuller looked sadly and gravely at him, but finding that he still laughed, he bowed with much mock politeness and stalked onwards in his borrowed clothes. Alleyne watched him until he was small in the distance, and then, wiping the tears from his eyes, he set off briskly once more upon his journey. Chapter 4. How the Bailiff of Southampton slew the two masterless men. The road along which he travelled was scarce as populous as most other roads in the kingdom, and far less so than those which lie between the larger towns. Yet from time to time Alleyne met other wayfarers, and more than once was overtaken by strings of pack mules and horsemen journeying in the same direction as himself. Once a begging friar came limping along in a brown habit, imploring in a most dolorous voice to give him a single groat to buy bread wherewith to save himself from impending death. Alleyne passed him swiftly by, for he had learned from the monks to have no love for the wandering friars, and, besides, there was a great half-gnawed mutton bone sticking out of his pouch to prove him a liar. Swiftly as he went, however, he could not escape the curse of the four blessed evangelists which the mendicant howled behind him. So dreadful are his execrations that the frightened lad thrust his fingers into his ear-holes, and ran until the fellow was but a brown smirch upon the yellow road. Further on, at the edge of the woodland, he came upon a chapman and his wife, who sat upon a fallen tree. He had put his pack down as a table, and the two of them were devouring a great pasty, and washing it down with some drink from a stone jar. The chapman broke a rough jest as he passed, and the woman called shrilly to Alleyne to come and join them, on which the man, turning suddenly from mirth to wrath, began to bellabore her with his cudgel. Alleyne hastened on, lest he make more mischief, and his heart was heavy as lead within him. Look where he would, he seemed to see nothing but injustice and violence and the hardness of man to man. But even as he brooded sadly over it and pined for the sweet peace of the abbey, he came on an open space dotted with holly bushes, where was the strangest sight that he had yet chanced upon. Near to the pathway lay a long clump of greenery, and from behind this there stuck straight up into the air 4 human legs clad in party-coloured hosen, yellow and black. Strangest of all was when a brisk tune struck suddenly up and the 4 legs began to kick and twitter in time to the music. Walking on tiptoe round the bushes, he stood in amazement to see 2 men bounding about on their heads, while they played, the one a viol and the other a pipe, as merrily and as truly as though they were seated in a choir. Alleyne crossed himself as he gazed at this unnatural sight, and could scarce hold his ground with a steady face, when the 2 dancers, catching sight of him, came bouncing in his direction. A spear's length from him, they each threw a somersault into the air, and came down upon their feet with smirking faces and their hands over their hearts. A guerdon, my knight of the staring eyes," cried one. "A gift, my prince," shouted the other. "Any trifle will serve, a purse of gold, or even a jeweled goblet." Alleyne thought of what he had read of demoniac possession, the jumpings, the twitchings, the wild talk. It was in his mind to repeat over the exorcism proper to such attacks, but the 2 burst out laughing at his scared face, and turning onto their heads once more, clapped their heels in derision. "Hast never seen tumblers before?" asked the elder, a black-browed, swarthy man, as brown and supple as a hazel twig. "Why shrink from us, then, as though we were the spawn of the evil one? Why shrink, my honeybird? Why so afeard, my sweet cinnamon?" exclaimed the other, a loose-jointed lanky youth with a dancing, roguish eye. "Truly, sirs, it is a new sight to me," the clerk answered. "When I saw your 4 legs above the bush I could scarce credit my own eyes. Why is it that you do this thing?" "A dry question to answer," cried the younger, coming back onto his feet. "A most husky question, my fair bird. But how? A flask, by all that is wonderful." He shot out his hand as he spoke, and plucking Alleyne's bottle out of his scrip, he deftly knocked the neck off, and poured the half of it down his throat. The rest he handed to his comrade, who drank the wine, and then, to the clerk's increasing amazement, made a show of swallowing the bottle, with such skill that Alleyne seemed to see it vanish down his throat. A moment later, however, he flung it over his head, and caught it bottom downwards upon the calf of his left leg. "We thank you for the wine, kind sir," said he, "and for the ready courtesy wherewith you offered it. Touching your question, we may tell you that we are strollers and jugglers, who, having performed with much applause at Winchester Fair, are now on our way to the great Michaelmas market at Ringwood. As our art is a very fine and delicate one, however, we cannot let a day go by without exercising ourselves in it, to which end we choose some quiet and sheltered spot where we may break our journey. Here you find us, and we cannot wonder that you, who are new to tumbling, should be astounded, since many great barons, earls, marshals and knights, who have wandered as far as the Holy Land, are of one mind in saying that they have never seen a more noble or gracious performance. If you will be pleased to sit upon that stump, we will now continue our exercise." Alleyne sat down willingly as directed, with 2 great bundles on either side of him which contained the strollers' dresses, doublets of flame-coloured silk and girdles of leather, spangled with brass and tin. The jugglers were on their heads once more, bounding about with rigid necks, playing the while in perfect time and tune. It chanced that out of one of the bundles there stuck the end of what the clerk saw to be a cittern, so drawing it forth, he tuned it up and twanged a harmony to the merry lilt which the dancers played. On that they dropped their own instruments, and putting their hands to the ground they hopped about faster and faster, ever shouting to him to play more briskly, until at last for very weariness all 3 had to stop. "Well played, sweet poppet," cried the younger. just a rare touch on the strings. "How knew you the tune?" asked the other. "I knew it not. I did but follow the notes I heard." Both opened their eyes at this, and stared at Alleyne with as much amazement as he had shown at them. "You have a fine trick of ear then," said one. "We have long wished to meet such a man. Wilt join us and jog on to Ringwood? Thy duties shall be light, and thou shalt have 2 pence a day and meat for supper every night." "With as much beer as you can put away," said the other, "and a flask of Gascon wine on Sabbaths." "Nay, it may not be. I have other work to do. I have tarried with you over long," quoth Alleyne, and resolutely set forth upon his journey once more. They ran behind him some little way, offering him first 4 pence and then 6 pence a day, but he only smiled and shook his head, until at last they fell away from him. Looking back, he saw that the smaller had mounted on the younger's shoulders, and that they stood so, some 10 feet high, waving their adieus to him. He waved back to them, and then hastened on, the lighter of heart for having fallen in with these strange men of pleasure. Alleyne had gone no great distance for all the many small passages that had befallen him. Yet to him, used as he was to a life of such quiet that the failure of a brewing or the altering of an anthem had seemed to be of the deepest import, the quick changing play of the lights and shadows of life was strangely startling and interesting. A gulf seemed to divide this brisk uncertain existence from the old steady round of work and of prayer which he had left behind him. The few hours that had passed since he saw the abbey tower stretched out in his memory until they outgrew whole months of the stagnant life of the cloister. As he walked and munched the soft bread from his scrip, it seemed strange to him to feel that it was still warm from the ovens of Beaulieu. When he passed Penally, where were 3 cottages and a barn, he reached the edge of the tree country, and found the great barren heath of Blackdown stretching in front of him, all pink with heather and bronzed with the fading ferns. On the left the woods were still thick, but the road edged away from them and wound over the open. The sun lay low in the west upon a purple cloud, whence it threw a mild, chastening light over the wild moorland and glittered on the fringe of forest, turning the withered leaves into flakes of dead gold, the brighter for the black depths behind them. To the seeing eye decay is as fair as growth, and death as life. The thought stole into Alleyne's heart as he looked upon the autumnal countryside and marvelled at its beauty. He had little time to dwell upon it, however, for there were still 6 good miles between him and the nearest inn. He sat down by the roadside to partake of his bread and cheese, and then with a lighter scrip he hastened upon his way. There appeared to be more wayfarers on the down than in the forest. First he passed 2 Dominicans in their long black dresses, who swept by him with downcast looks and pattering lips, without so much as a glance at him. Then there came a grey friar, or minorite, with a good paunch upon him, walking slowly and looking about him with the air of a man who was at peace with himself and with all men. He stopped Alleyne to ask him whether it was not true that there was a hostel somewhere in those parts which was especially famous for the stewing of eels. The clerk having made answer that he had heard the eels of Soulé well spoken of, the friar sucked in his lips and hurried forward. Close at his heels came 3 laborious walking abreast, with spade and mattock over their shoulders. They sang some rude chorus right tunefully as they walked, but their English was so coarse and rough that to the ears of a cloister-bred man it sounded like a foreign and barbarous tongue. One of them carried a young bittern which they had caught upon the moor, and they offered it to Alleyne for a silver groat. Very glad he was to get safely past them, for, with their bristling red beards and their fierce blue eyes, they were uneasy men to bargain with upon a lonely moor. Yet it is not always the burliest and the wildest who are the most to be dreaded. The workers looked hungrily at him, and then jogged onwards upon their way in slow, lumbering Saxon style. A worse man to deal with was a wooden-legged cripple who came hobbling down the path, so weak and so old to all appearance that a child need not stand in fear of him. Yet when Alleyne had passed him, of a sudden, out of pure devilment, he screamed out a curse at him, and sent a jagged flint stone hurtling past his ear. So horrid was the causeless rage of the crooked creature, that the clerk came over a cold thrill, and took to his heels until he was out of shot from stone or word. It seemed to him that in this country of England there was no protection for a man save that which lay in the strength of his own arm and the speed of his own foot. In the cloisters he had heard vague talk of the law, the mighty law which was higher than prelate or baron, yet no sign could he see of it. What was the benefit of a law written fair upon parchment, he wondered, if there were no officers to enforce it? As it fell out, however, he had that very evening, ere the sun had set, a chance of seeing how stern was the grip of the English law when it did happen to seize the offender. A mile or so out upon the moor the road takes a very sudden dip into a hollow, with a peat-coloured stream running swiftly down the centre of it. To the right of this stood, and stands to this day, an ancient barrow, or burying mound, covered deeply in a bristle of heather and bracken. Alleyne was plodding down the slope upon one side, when he saw an old dame coming towards him upon the other, limping with weariness and leaning heavily upon a stick. When she reached the edge of the stream she stood helpless, looking to right and to left for some ford. Where the path ran down a great stone had been fixed in the centre of the brook, but it was too far from the bank for her aged and uncertain feet. Twice she thrust forward at it, and twice she drew back, until at last, giving up in despair, she sat herself down by the brink and wrung her hands wearily. There she still sat when Alleyne reached the crossing. "Come, mother," quoth he, "it is not so very perilous a passage." "Alas! Good youth," she answered, "I have a humour in the eyes, and though I can see that there is a stone there I can by no means be sure as to where it lies." "That is easily amended," said he cheerily, and picking her lightly up, for she was much worn with time, he passed across with her. He could not but observe, however, that as he placed her down her knees seemed to fail her, and she could scarcely prop herself up with her staff. "You are weak, mother," said he. "Hast journeyed far, I wot." "From Wiltshire, friend," said she, in a quavering voice, 3 days have I been on the road. I go to my son, who is one of the king's regarders at Brockenhurst. He has ever said that he would care for me in mine old age. And rightly too, mother, since you cared for him in his youth. But when have you broken fast? At Lindenhurst, but alas! My money is at an end, and I could but get a dish of bran porridge from the nunnery. Yet I trust that I may be able to reach Brockenhurst tonight, where I may have all that heart can desire, for oh! Sir, but my son is a fine man, with a kindly heart of his own, and it is as good as food to me to think that he should have a doublet of Lincoln green to his back and be the king's own paid man." "It is a long road yet to Brockenhurst," said Alleyne, "but here is such bread and cheese as I have left, and here, too, is a penny which may help you to supper. May God be with you." "May God be with you, young man," she cried. "May he make your heart as glad as you have made mine." She turned away, still mumbling blessings, and Alleyne saw her short figure and her long shadow stumbling slowly up the slope. He was moving away himself, when his eyes lit upon a strange sight, and one which sent a tingling through his skin. Out of the tangled scrub on the old overgrown barrow 2 human faces were looking out at him, the sinking sun glimmered full upon them, showing up every line and feature. The one was an oldish man with a thin beard, a crooked nose, and a broad red smudge from a birthmark over his temple. The other was a Negro, a thing rarely met in England at that day, and rarer still in the quiet Southland parts. Alleyne had read of such folk, but had never seen one before, and could scarce take his eyes from the fellow's broad pouting lip and shining teeth. Even as he gazed, however, the 2 came riding out from among the heather, and came down towards him with such a guilty, slinking carriage, that the clerk felt that there was no good in them, and hastened onwards upon his way. He had not gained the crown of the slope, when he heard a sudden scuffle behind him and a feeble voice bleating for help. Looking round, there was the old dame down upon the roadway, with her red wimple flying on the breeze, while the 2 rogues, black and white, stooped over her, wresting away from her the penny and such other poor trifles as were worth the taking. At the sight of her thin limbs struggling in weak resistance, such a glow of fierce anger passed over Alleyne as set his head in a whirl. Dropping his scrip, he bounded over the stream once more, and made for the 2 villains, with his staff whirled over his shoulder and his grey eyes blazing with fury. The robbers, however, were not disposed to leave their victim until they had worked their wicked will upon her. The black man, with the woman's crimson scarf tied round his swarthy head, stood forward in the centre of the path, with a long dull-coloured knife in his hand, while the other, waving a ragged cudgel, cursed at Alleyne and dared him to come on. His blood was fairly aflame, however, and he needed no such challenge. Dashing at the black man, he smote at him with such good will that the other let his knife tinkle into the roadway, and hopped howling to a safer distance. The second rogue, however, made of sterner stuff, rushed in upon the clerk, and clipped him round the waist with a grip like a bear, shouting the while to his comrade to come round and stab him in the back. At this the negro took heart of grace, and picking up his dagger again he came stealing with prowling step and murderous eye, while the two swayed backwards and forwards, staggering this way and that. In the very midst of the scuffle, however, whilst Alleyne braced himself to feel the cold blade between his shoulders, there came a sudden scurry of hoofs, and the black man yelled with terror and ran for his life through the heather. The man with the birthmark, too, struggled to break away, and Alleyne heard his teeth chatter and felt his limbs grow limp to his hand. At this sign of coming aid the clerk held on the tighter, and at last was able to pin his man down and glanced behind him to see where all the noise was coming from. Down the slanting road there was riding a big, burly man, clad in a tunic of purple velvet and driving a great black horse as hard as it could gallop. He leaned well over its neck as he rode, and made a heaving with his shoulders at every bound as though he were lifting the steed instead of it carrying him. In the rapid glance Alleyne saw that he had white doeskin gloves, a curling white feather in his flat velvet cap, and a broad gold, embroidered baldric across his bosom. Behind him rode 6 others, 2 and 2, clad in sober brown jerkins, with the long yellow staves of their bows thrusting out from behind their right shoulders. Down the hill they thundered, over the brook and up to the scene of the contest. "Here is one," said the leader, springing down from his reeking horse, and seizing the white rogue by the edge of his jerkin. "This is one of them. I know him by that devil's touch upon his brow. Where are your cords, Peterkin? So. Bind him hand and foot. His last hour has come. And you, young man, who may you be?" "I am a clerk, sir, travelling from Beaulieu." "A clerk," cried the other. "Art from Oxenford or from Cambridge? Hast thou a letter from the Chancellor of thy college giving thee a permit to beg? Let me see thy letter." He had a stern, square face, with bushy side whiskers and a very questioning eye. "I am from Beaulieu Abbey, and I have no need to beg," said Alleyne, who was all of a tremble now that the ruffle was over. "The better for thee," the other answered. "Dost know who I am?" "No, sir, I do not." "I am the law." Nodding his head solemnly. "I am the law of England and the mouthpiece of His Most Gracious and Royal Majesty, Edward III. Alleyne louted low to the king's representative. "Truly you came in good time, honoured sir," said he. "A moment later and they would have slain me." "But there should be another one," cried the man in the purple coat. "There should be a black man. A shipman with St. Anthony's fire, and a black man who had served him as cook, those other pair that we are in chase of." "The black man fled over to that side," said Alleyne, pointing towards the barrow. "He could not have gone far, Sir Bailiff," cried one of the archers, unslinging his bow. "He is in hiding somewhere, for he knew well, black Paynim as he is, that our horses for legs could outstrip his too." "Then we shall have him," said the other. "It shall never be said, whilst I am bailiff of Southampton, that any waster, reaver, drawlatch, or murderer came scathless away from me and my posse. Leave that rogue lying. Now stretch out in line, my merry ones, with arrow on string, and I shall show you such sport as only the king can give. You on the left, Howard, and Thomas of Redbridge upon the right. So. Beat high and low among the heather, and a pot of wine to the lucky marksman." As it chanced, however, the searchers had not far to seek. the negro had burrowed down into his hiding place upon the barrow, where he might have lain snug enough, had it not been for the red gear upon his head. As he raised himself to look over the bracken at his enemies, the staring colour caught the eye of the bailiff, who broke into a long screeching whoop and spurred forward sword in hand. Seeing himself discovered, the man rushed out from his hiding place, and bounded at the top of his speed down the line of archers, keeping a good 100 paces to the front of them. The two who were on either side of Alleyne bent their bows as calmly as though they were shooting at the popinjay at the village fair. 7 yards windage, how, said one, whose hair was streaked with grey. 5, replied the other, letting loose his string. Alleyne gave a gulp in his throat, for the yellow streak seemed to pass through the man, but he still ran forward. 7, you jackfool, growled the first speaker, and his bow twanged like a harp-string. The black man sprang high up into the air, and shot out both his arms and his legs, coming down all a-sprawl among the heather. Right under the blade bone, quoth the archer, sauntering forward for his arrow. The old hound is the best when all is said, quoth the bailiff of Southampton, as they made back for the roadway. That means a quart of the best malmsey in Southampton this very night, Matthew Atwood. Art sure that he is dead? Dead as Pontius Pilate, worshipful sir. It is well. Now, as to the other knave. There are trees and to spare over yonder, but we have scarce leisure to make for them. Draw thy sword, Thomas of Redbridge, and hew me his head from his shoulders. A boon, gracious sir, a boon, cried the condemned man. What then? Asked the bailiff. I will confess to my crime. It was indeed I and the black cook, both from the ship La Rose de Gloire, of Southampton, who did set upon the Flanders merchant and rob him of his spicery and his mercery, for which, as we well know, you hold a warrant against us. There is little merit in this confession, quoth the bailiff sternly. Thou hast done evil within my bailiwick, and must die. But, sir, urged Alleyne, who was white to the lips at these bloody doings, he hath not yet come to trial. Young clerk, said the bailiff, you speak of that of which you know nothing. It is true that he hath not come to trial, but the trial hath come to him. He hath fled the law and is beyond its pale. Touch not that which is no concern of thine. But what is this boon, rogue, which you would crave? I have in my shoe, most worshipful sir, a strip of wood which belonged once to the bark wherein the blessed pool was dashed up against the island of Melita. I bought it for 2 rose nobles from a shipman who came from the Levant. The boon I crave is that you will place it in my hands and let me die still grasping it. In this manner, not only shall my own eternal salvation be secured, but thine also, for I shall never cease to intercede for thee. At the command of the bailiff they plucked off the fellow's shoe, and there sure enough at the side of the instep, wrapped in a piece of fine sendal, lay a long, dark splinter of wood. The archers doffed caps at the sight of it, and the bailiff crossed himself devoutly as he handed it to the robber. If it should chance, he said, that through the surpassing merits of the blessed Paul your sin-stained soul should gain a way into paradise, I trust that you will not forget that intercession which you have promised. Bear in mind too, that it is her ward the bailiff for whom you pray, and not her ward the sheriff, who is my uncle's son. Now, Thomas, I pray you dispatch, for we have a long ride before us and sun has already set. Alleyne gazed upon the scene, the portly velvet-clad official, the knot of hard-faced archers with their hands to the bridles of their horses, the thief with his arms trussed back and his doublet turned down upon his shoulders. By the side of the track the old dame was standing, fastening her red wimple once more round her head. Even as he looked one of the archers drew his sword with a sharp whir of steel and stepped up to the lost man. The clerk hurried away in horror, but, ere he had gone many paces, he heard a sudden, sullen thump, with a choking, whistling sound at the end of it. A minute later the bailiff and 4 of his men rode past him on their journey back to Southampton, the other 2 having been chosen as gravediggers. As they passed Alleyne saw that one of the men was wiping his sword blade upon the manet of his horse. A deadly sickness came over him at the sight, and sitting down by the wayside he burst out weeping, with his nerves all in a jangle. It was a terrible world, thought he, and it was hard to know which were the most to be dreaded, the knaves or the men of the law.